All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History, and I want to say thank you for joining us today for the now fourth webinar in our six-part series exploring the National Park Service's criteria for establishing World War II heritage cities. Over last week, this week, and next week, we're learning about the criteria for purposes of applications and evaluation by Park Service staff from the authors of our essay series on the topic. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Kurt Piehler on Criteria 6, Civil Defense Preparedness. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. Closed captions have been enabled for this webinar, and if you don't see them automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This webinar is also being recorded for those who cannot attend or anyone who wishes to review the materials discussed, and we will send a link to all of the recordings out at the end of the series next week. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted unless you have a question to ask during the Q&A. And at any time, you can pop questions into the chat area or the Q&A module in your Zoom, and we will have ample time at the end for questions and discussions with Dr. Piehler. I also want to extend greetings from Dr. Turkaya Lowe, Deputy Federal Preservation Officer for the National Park Service, as well as Principal Historian managing the Park History Program. Unfortunately, Dr. Lowe can't be with us today, but I wanted to share some greetings. Under Section 9007 of the John Dingell Act of 2019, the Secretary of the Interior may designate one city per state or territory as an American World War II heritage city. This designation recognizes and ensures the continued preservation and interpretation of the history of the United States home front in World War II. There are currently 18 jurisdictions designated as American World War II heritage cities. The criteria for becoming a designated jurisdiction are 1, contributions by that city or jurisdiction to the World War II home front effort, and 2, the city's achievements to preserve the heritage and legacy of those contributions to the war effort and to preserving World War II history as a whole. Within these two broad categories, there are actually 15 topics or areas in the war effort contributions and preservation and commemoration activities that are called out in the criteria. The National Park Service worked with my organization, the National Council on Public History, to partner with authors like Dr. Piehler to explore these specific topics. We hope that you're able to join us for the remaining 2 webinars in the series, one of which is tomorrow at the same time. For more information about the American World War II Heritage Cities program, we're providing links in the chat. Thank you to Kathleen for putting those in. And last, you can also contact the program via email at aww2hc@nps.gov, and I will put that email into the chat as well. Now, last, I would like to give a warm welcome to our speaker for today, Dr. G. Kurt Piehler, Director of the Institute of World War II and the Human Experience at Florida State University. Dr. Piehler is author of A Religious History of the American GI in World War II, Remembering War the American Way, and World War II in the American Soldiers' Lives series. Piehler is the editor of Encyclopedia of Military Sciences, Oxford Handbook of World War II, and Major Problems in American Military, among many others. He is a member of the editorial board of the Service Newspapers of World War II digital publication and on the advisory board of the NEH-funded American Soldier Project at Virginia Tech University. He also served as the lead curator for the exhibit Rendezvous with Destiny, Florida and World War II at the Florida Historic Capitol Museum. Piehler has held academic positions at the City University of New York, Drew University, Rutgers University, and the University of Tennessee. In 2008, he served as Fulbright Lecturer in American Studies at Kobe University and Kyoto University. He served as National Historical Publications and Records Commission Fellow in Historical Editing at the Peel Family Papers, National Portrait Gallery, Smithsonian. As founding director of the Rutgers Oral History Archives, he has conducted more than 200 interviews with veterans of World War II. Born in Nyack, New York, Piehler attended public schools in the Fresh Meadows neighborhood of Queens, New York, and later Mount Arlington and Roxbury, New Jersey. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Drew University, he holds a master's degree and doctorate in history from Rutgers University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Piehler, and I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, well, thank you. I've really enjoyed both working on the two essays. I did the one on rationing, and last week I spoke on rationing and veterans housing, and today I'm going to talk about civil defense. And I would say, even if you have a smattering of knowledge about World War II and particularly the American home front, you sort of know about civil defense. Also, I am part of the tail end of the baby boom generation. So I remember when civil defense centered on nuclear war. So I actually, in Fresh Meadows, Queens, remember duck and cover drills like in 1965, 66. It's a very vivid memory. And there is a real link between World War II civil defense and the evolution of civil defense during the Cold War, and then the evolution of civil defense into disaster preparedness. And on the federal level, the Office of Civil Defense becomes FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association. I think we most associate civil defense, and often with artifacts. In many communities, I suspect they're in attics or even in local museums, the CD, civil defense helmet, and also signs encouraging people to comply with civil defense. But it's interesting, many years ago, I had some inkling that civil defense was a little more complicated. I was working on a reader on World War II for Wiley Blackwell. And I was looking for documents on the home front. And one of the sets of documents I was looking at was in the Newark Public Library of New Jersey, in the manuscript division there, in the New Jersey room. And there were the minutes of this Civil Defense Council. And I was kind of surprised, like some of the things they were considering. It wasn't just air raid drills. They were really working on the issue of how to provide war workers, particularly women, with access to daycare. And they were trying to marshal community resources, nonprofits, particularly religious nonprofits, to find places for women who were working in the war effort to have a place for childcare. So when we talk about civil defense, it's a much more actually interesting and more complicated thing than just simply preparing for an enemy attack. I do want to give a shout out to two tremendously useful resources. On this particular topic, Matthew Dalek's book, Dalek, D-A-L-L-E-C-K, Defenseless Under the Night, The Roosevelt Years and the Origins of Homeland Security, which is wonderfully written and really shows the complexity of civil defense. The other book that both applies to this topic, but I think every topic, and if your community is fortunate enough to be written about in this book, Alistair Cooke wrote a memoir of his travels through America in 1941, 1942. I used it for an exhibit I did on Florida and World War II, because he has some wonderful comments about Florida, what's going on in Florida, and has a number of comments about civil defense preparation. In fact, he talks specifically about civil defense preparations and in Tallahassee, Florida. And he also will talk about the Seminole tribe involvement in civil defense efforts. So now let me start going to the big picture. And I think always with World War II, keep in mind, even though the focus here is on local communities, states, and the American war effort, America is part of this global war. And one of the things that makes America distinctive is for the most part, the continental United States is spared direct enemy attack. But when you talk about civil defense for the American territories, many American territories come under direct attack. And in some cases are occupied, such as Hawaii, which was then a territory, Alaska, Guam, Wake Island, and what was still an American colony, the Philippines. And so their civil defense is not sort of an esoteric exercise. And I think one of the things I would have liked to have found more information in writing my essay is, how did the civil defense respond in Hawaii to the attack on December 7th, December 7th, December 8th. How effective? What were the efforts? Civil defense is sort of a global. When I say the global dimension, it's a very much a global. There's a global effort to sort of create civil defense efforts. The need to counteract essentially direct enemy attacks on civilians, specifically bombing. And when we're in the 1930s, and particularly once World War II breaks out, we are observing the impact of war on civilians from bombing campaigns. And that will very much influence how Americans think about how they need to prepare for World War II. The other thing about in sort of documenting your cities or communities' involvement in World War II and a Homefront city, keep in mind that really after the fall of France in June of 1940, the Roosevelt administration and many communities begin mobilizing for the war effort. That make sure you don't start your story with Pearl Harbor, because in fact, in the case of civil defense, there's a tremendous gearing up for civil defense beginning after the fall of France, but particularly in 1941. As I said, World War II, the civil defense effort does touch enormous numbers of lives. Now, it's probably not as many as rationing. It's almost impossible to escape rationing, but it touches people's lives because hundreds of thousands of Americans serve in civil defense efforts. In many ways, probably actually millions is more accurate, in various capacities. There are restrictions on movement of people during an air raid drill. If you watch some of the great iconic Bugs Bunny cartoons, there's often jokes about lights out during an air raid drill. And I think one of the things that I have an appreciation in studying this topic anew on civil defense, and some of the recent scholarship, and some of my own research is, I think it's sometimes hard to capture the fear of both policymakers like Eleanor Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, and average Americans had regarding the possibility of a direct enemy attack on American soil. We were watching the war from a distance, but we were alarmed, for example, of the impact, for example, of the Blitz on Britain, and in fact, in structuring our civil defense efforts, Fiorello LaGuardia, as mayor of New York, begins to prepare civil defense efforts in his cities. He will, for example, send a delegation of firefighters, New York City firefighters, to London to learn how from London firefighters how they deal with the Blitz. To give you some sense of how widespread the effort is to volunteer, when I was organizing the exhibit on Florida in World War II for the Tennessee Historic Capitol Museum, over 750,000 Floridians responded to the State Defense Council's request for volunteers, with ultimately just shy of 340,000 given actual positions. So that's just one state alone, how massive the civil defense effort is. Now, I think civil defense in a lot of histories is often dismissed because ultimately the enemy lacks long-range bombers. So why do we put so much effort in air raid drills and in this, amassing all these resources in terms of air raids? I think, that we sort of recognize that ultimately, although it is interesting on that point that Gerhard Weinberg does write about the efforts by the Germans, fortunately unsuccessful, to build a long-range bomber for America. But the civil defense efforts where they were probably most important was on the coasts on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, because their civil defense measures will prove to be very, very important. And as I said, there are certain American territories do come under direct enemy attack, beginning with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the first efforts actually to start thinking and organizing to civil defense comes shortly after the fall of France. And we undertake a number of measures, beginning with federalizing the state National Guards. And one of the efforts that's very much related to civil defense, and what we often now term Homeland Security, was the need for states to come up with a new. Many states decided with the National Guard serving the federal government, who would they call upon, for example, if the state was directly attacked, or to deal with a bombing campaign that would hit the state, need to preserve civil order in the case of a range of issues where you need to call in the National Guard. So a number of states created state guards during the war. And this is, I think, tied to the efforts to promote civil defense. The other thing about civil defense is it's a very much a federalized, it's a joint federal state effort. So you will have the federal government create an Office of Civil Defense, and funds will be provided for the states. But the Roosevelt administration calls upon states to create state defense councils and to take civil defense measures, and states really vary in their interest in doing this. For example, Oregon refuses to establish a council until June of 1941, even though 35 states had created them. In California, the governor had legal authority to implement a state council, state defense council, and civil defense matters, but he needed the legislature to fund it. Having said all that, and that's why I said the story, don't start your World War II story about your community out with Pearl Harbor, because despite some reluctance of some states to create local state defense councils, by November of 1941, a month before Pearl Harbor, you have, all 48 states have created one. Fiorello LaGuardia, who is a Republican mayor of New York, but in many ways, despite his affiliation with the Republican Party, is very much a New Dealer. He is really pushing the Roosevelt administration to take active measures to protect American civilians, as is First Lady Fiorello LaGuardia. And when in looking at your community's role in civil defense, look for whether either Eleanor or Fiorello LaGuardia actually came through your city or town during World War II to talk about civil defense, because both of them did whirlwind tours to promote civil defense in your community. They also, we would say, and as I said, civil defense has a much more complicated history than I even initially realized, until I started really researching this topic. And as I started my talk, I talked about discovering these documents from the Newark Defense Council in charge of civil defense and this interest in childcare. There was two competing visions in civil defense and somewhat overlapping divisions. Both Eleanor Roosevelt and LaGuardia, wanted to prepare America to deal with the possibility of a bombing campaign that might, for example, include poison gas. There was a real concern with subversion of enemy agents conducting sabotage. But Eleanor also had a vision for civil defense that this effort to marshal civil defense would also try to marshal Americans working cooperatively and largely through volunteer efforts to improve the life of average Americans and communities, and sort of much like the New Deal sought to do, to improve nutrition, housing, educational opportunities for citizens. By executive order in May of 1941, the Office of Civil Defense is established with Fiorello LaGuardia wearing two hats. He remains mayor of New York City, but also then heads the civil defense effort. And Eleanor, she actually will hold a government position. She actually has a government appointment with the Office of Civil Defense, and doesn't get she doesn't get a salary, but she actually is a government appointee, and the first as a first lady, and that was unprecedented. The civil defense effort depends heavily on volunteer, average citizen volunteers and a host of organizations particularly public schools and communities, veterans groups like the American Legion, but even, for example, universities got involved. For example, Vanderbilt. I write in my essay about this. Vanderbilt University even offered a class for citizens on how to care for pets after an air raid. One of the things to look for in the civil defense effort, I think there were several important parts of it. One was to prepare for a possible air raid, and so for example, to teach people the need to black out during an air raid. And in fact, you get business people going into business, trying to sell air raid shades and other things you would need for an air raid. Gas masks are actually purchased by individuals to deal with a gas attack. You will have educational film put out by the federal government, by the Office of Civil Defense. I remember one that I've seen on Turner Classic Movies was what to do if there's a gas attack, a poison gas attack, how to deal with that if you're in your home, or what measures you should take. But the other part of that civil defense effort is creating a huge network, an aircraft warning system as part of the civil defense efforts. So thousands upon thousands of observation posts are put up around the country, particularly along coastal states, to look for enemy aircraft. And that effort, states and communities start building, as part of these, often are the sites of observation towers. There's also an effort related to that will be the creation of the Civil Air Patrol. And that's a fascinating effort because it is civilian. It's created in December of 1941. It is civilian, and one of the aims of Civil Air Patrol, particularly as related to civil defense, will be to actually patrol the American coastline, looking for German submarines. And in fact, at one point during the war, eventually the civil defense would be taken over by the Defense Department. But it's an interesting service in terms of, for example, until the federal government took charge of the local civil air patrols, so many civil air patrols were integrated, and also large numbers of women pilots served in the civil air patrol, and they play an important role in dealing with the submarine attack. The tie to, in looking at the civil defense efforts, I mean, first aid was also part of that effort. It gives an enormous boost to the work of the American Red Cross. For example, the American Official Red Cross Handbook on first aid becomes a bestseller. In some communities, like for example, Kent, Kentucky, there's apathy in some communities, but for example, in Kent, Connecticut, volunteer efforts involve all but 200 of the 1,200 residents. But as I said, each community will have different stories. For example, the mayor of Buffalo is reluctant to do anything. He waits until Pearl Harbor to have a civil defense structure. I mentioned, Alistair Cook's Tour of America in 1941-42. He writes, being in Des Moines, they were very skeptical that enemy bombers would ever reach Des Moines. And so they tasked the Junior League to be air raid wardens in that city. Race plays in looking at your community, race does play a role. Now, civil defense efforts in many northern and midwestern and western communities will actually be integrated, and there'll be there'll be a high degree of participation of African Americans in an integrated context. In the case of southern states, their civil defense efforts mirror the segregation of the armed forces and American society in many parts of the country, particularly in the South. There'll be fairly rigid segregation. So, for example, in the case of Florida, there's basically two complementary systems of civil defense. There's sort of a white-led civil defense council, but it's mirrored by an African American defense council with almost duplicate structures. Many prominent and I would say, but many prominent civilian leaders, both white and black, do participate. So in the case of Florida, some very prominent African American leaders participate. I think I did not have I remember doing interviews with World War II veterans and people on the home front, and I think until the attack of 9/11, I did not get a sense of the fear of that Americans feared after Pearl Harbor, and also if you delve into your communities, into the history, particularly in many communities on the West Coast, but even on the East Coast, the fear that attack after Pearl Harbor could strike the continental United States, just there is a lot of fear. What's also distressing is you will in fact have false alarms right after Pearl Harbor, and in fact cities do undergo. They activate the civil defense structures to deal with what is feared as an enemy attack. In fact, Fiorella LaGuardia and First Lady Roosevelt are flying into a West Coast city, and there's reports of an enemy attack, and the city is paralyzed at this fear over this purported attack. LaGuardia, despite all the preparations he makes in New York City, is distressed when an air raid drill occurs, and people, for example, rather than taking shelter in their office buildings and getting off the street, actually flock into the streets. So the preparation is often in those trying days after Pearl Harbor, the fear and how civil defense efforts are not quite up to stuff, that people often don't heed them, and there's a lot of chaos. There's also real divisions between Eleanor Roosevelt's vision and also Fiorella LaGuardia's vision over what civil defense does, because LaGuardia is more focused on dealing with a direct enemy attack, while Eleanor has a broader vision. Ultimately, both leave the Office of Civil Defense, and you actually have a new person coming in, a former head of the Harvard Law School, and a former head of the Securities Exchange Commission, James Landis. And Landis will downplay the efforts to sort of promote improving the life of average Americans, and really focusing on dealing with the potential of a direct enemy attack. And I would have to say, as I said, it becomes, for example, by 1943, civil defense efforts at dealing with the potential of an enemy aircraft attack really stand out. It's pretty clear by the course of the war that that's not going to take place. But what I do want to now talk about is where civil defense measures were in fact really important, and that was the Battle of the Atlantic. And while America, with a few exceptions, is spared, continental America, United States, is spared direct enemy attack, the enemy comes fairly close. And so shortly after Pearl Harbor, the German submarine campaigns, the Germans shift a lot of their submarines to the Caribbean on the east coast of the United States. And for the German U-boats, this becomes the happy time for them, because they're able to sink a huge amount of American shipping, particularly oil tankers. It's one of the reasons rationing becomes necessary, because we lose so many oil tankers in early 1942. One of the reasons the German Navy was so successful in this campaign was the U.S. Navy decision not to convoy ships along the coastal trade, despite what the British Canadians were encouraging the U.S. to do. Admiral King decides not to sort of convoy ships on the coastal trade. He thinks the way to deal with the submarine threat is to attack submarines, to hunt for them. Our losses are so bad at one point that the British end up sending a whole squadron of destroyer and destroyer escorts to the American waters. And as they said, the Battle of the Atlantic is very much, on the shores of America. If you go to, say, for example, Ocracoke, North Carolina, there is a small British cemetery because a British warship was sunk off the coast of Ocracoke, dealing with the submarine threat. It was sunk by a German submarine. Bodies washed ashore on Ocracoke, and a British cemetery exists there. Civil defense measures become actually very important, on the coast. For example, you dim the lights so that enemy bombers have a difficult time to find a city, to find targets. Well, it becomes very important to dim lights on coastal communities so that American merchant ships are not silhouetted, that they're harder to detect. There is also Germans actually do land saboteurs on the coastline. One group of saboteurs lands in Long Island, and we very quickly learn of the presence of these saboteurs from a great accident. Nothing planned. In Florida, they actually land without being detected at all, and actually make their way to New York. And largely, the saboteurs, particularly the Florida group and the group in general, is detected because one of the saboteurs gets cold feet and calls the FBI. And initially, the FBI is slow in doing that. One of the responses to that fear, and actually, there were, in fact, we know 2 cases of saboteurs who actually, successfully land before they're apprehended. One group in Long Island, one in Florida. The Coast Guard will implement, as part of Homeland Security, coastal patrols. So scores of Coast Guard are deployed along the East Coast and Gulf Coast, patrolling beaches. And this is very much part of, in a broader sense, of civil defense efforts. Although Jim Landis would in fact downplay the sort of broader, how do I put it, the using civil defense to improve American society in general. There is an effort by the civil defense effort leadership to use this organization to, in fact, spur support for the war. So, for example, in July of 1942, air raid wardens were encouraged to visit every household in their community and ask a series of questions about support for the war effort, encouraging people to conserve food, to buy war bonds, to make sure they squelched rumors. There are, even though on the federal level, once Eleanor departs, there's less effort to sort of promote the greater good. Some defense councils still carry on that task. Some turn, you have a lot of Americans who get civil defense training. A lot of state defense councils, local defense councils turn to improving public health. The structure becomes very useful, for example, for dealing with natural disasters like forest fires. And as I said, one of the legacies, I think, of World War II is the evolution into defense preparedness, both on the federal level with FEMA and state disaster agencies. In 1943, when it's clear direct enemy attack is not going to happen, there's an effort to create block captains out of the civil defense structure, and again to promote support for the war effort and to sort of have individuals with the civil defense effort engage average citizens, encouraging them to support the war effort. In looking at the legacy of civil defense, the efforts are shut down in May of 1945. Even before victory against Japan, we shut down the effort. But soon as the Cold War heats up, civil defense efforts are in fact revived, and World War II is very much the model for how we initially structure civil defense efforts during the Cold War, and then over time this evolves into FEMA. I again want to really sort of close and opening up to questions is how individual the stories will be for your community. Some communities will show enormous interest in civil defense, and years ago when I was looking at Morristown, New Jersey, looking at newspapers for a topic related to the memory of American Revolution over time there. I was going through some of the World War II years. And I was stunned by how much reporting there was about civil defense efforts, really following the efforts to get people to volunteer. You know, I remember one distinctive article waiting, you know, talking about waiting for the helmets to arrive. That many you have some wonderful photographs. So, for example, cities like Chicago and New York, that, you know, where they do a practice lights out, and a city aglow, is now pitch black. So every state, every community will in fact have, and don't assume even if you're an interior city, it's going to be like you're in the Midwest, that civil defense wasn't taken seriously. In some places it wasn't, or the city leaders realized this was not a likely event. But in places like in Nashville, they organized a huge demonstration of a simulated bombing campaign to show the importance of that. Well, let me leave plenty of time for questions, and I can definitely elaborate on the points I've made.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And as a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat feature in Zoom, and I will help facilitate that. But you are also welcome to use the raise hand feature if you prefer to ask your question by speaking with Dr. Piehler directly. Just to kind of start things, I guess I'm curious if you've noticed any trends and differences or similarities between how rural areas approached defense preparedness versus more urban areas, or if you notice anything kind of interest in that regard.
I guess so I think some small communities like some small rural communities, I think particularly on the coast, took it very seriously. And I think there is the reach of civil defense is really intriguing. And I think one of the things to come out of this project, I'd be very curious the full extent of that in different parts of the country. But I think some of that participation is real, genuine fear. And I think, and then secondly, I think civil defense is an effort for people to show their support for the war and the war effort. So that, there are lots of volunteers. I would also say, to give some sense of rural, I mean, in the case of Florida, which I know probably the best now in terms of some of this, is that rural Florida is just dotted with air raid warning, towers and civilians watching the skies for enemy aircraft.
Thank you for that. I'd be curious if anyone on the webinar today is from a designated jurisdiction that has any thoughts to share. We'd welcome hearing those as well, particularly if this is a criteria or topic you engage with in the nomination process. I wonder, just because we were able to hear from you last week on another one of the criteria, and I'm wondering the kind of overlap that you might have seen between the two, because of course all of these criteria have intersections and overlap.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things they use the civil defense structure to is air raid wardens starting to visit, and then later creating block leaders, is encouraging people to sort of support the war effort. And one of that supporting the war effort was buying war bonds, but also adhering to rationing and avoiding rumors. So there is a real, like, the civil defense, as I said, rationing, no one can escape rationing unless you're like in the army, you're in the military itself, or you're literally like you're a prisoner. You're going to get, everyone gets ration books, and even if you try to evade, even for those evading the rationing, you're still part, as the black market, you're very much, it just influences everyone. Civil defense, you can sort of in some ways avoid, but in many places you cannot, at least when there's an air raid drill. But it also shows how many Americans are involved in the war effort. The amount of volunteering is in the millions.
Yeah, thank you. Now we have a question from Kathleen Madigan. who asks, early on, with the push by the OCD and others to get states and large communities to focus on civil defense, why did many of them downplay or ignore civil defense?
I think some of it is places like in the Midwest. There's a certain skepticism about it. Secondly, I think it does. I mean, there are non-interventionists. I mean, there's a real debate about entering World War II, and I think some, it's no coincidence Fiorello LaGuardia is heavily involved in preparing New York for World War II and for civil defense, because he expects America to enter the war. He's a strident anti-fascist. When I also would say about the reach of like civil defense, and actually I don't think I even put this in my paper, but it's in my book on the religious history of the American GI. I mean, one of the things that Fiorello LaGuardia issues before we actually enter the war, he issues this sort of flyer, and he sends it out to churches and synagogues all over America, and he wants them to he gives sermon suggestions to these rabbis and priests and ministers. They should have a defense Sunday where they should talk about preparing America for war, and this drives particularly non-interventionists, like it drives the federal council. A lot of church leaders who are associated with the Federal Council of Churches, they're non-interventionists, and they also think this is intruding on church and state. But it shows this real effort, I think, trying to have defense. So essentially, Defense Sunday and a day of a worship service centered on preparing America for war. This becomes very polarizing.
That's wonderful. We also had a comment from Eric Lopez, who needs to leave for another meeting, but says, thank you so much. This history is very much still present in Puerto Rico as defender of the Panama Canal. And I wondered if you wanted to add anything about sort of that geographic perspective.
Yeah, and as I said, Puerto Rico particularly is very much on the front. Coastal cities initially in 1941, 42, and 43, even into 43, are very much frontline places that submarines are being sunk right off the coast of New York. And it is intriguing. People on the beach in New Jersey are at one point watching a German submarine surface and starting to, using the deck gun to strafe a sinking American warship. Out in Jacksonville, people gathered as they watched an American merchant ship aflame sinking. So Puerto Rico is very much concerns over protecting the Panama Canal, but also the submarine war is really, as he said, the territories have I think a very distinctive history here.
Thank you. Heather Adkins writes, in your research, have you found that communities near or around Army bases or other large installations give special emphasis to civil defense? For example, would a local government near an Army base place greater weight on full community mobilization?
That I really don't know for sure. I would suspect yes, but I'm not as sure of, to be honest. That's actually something that needs that would need, I think, more investigation. Although I think one other point I would say, I'm not sure where it fits into the criteria, but it's just amazing how many bases there are in America. So I did an NEH workshop this summer on the long civil rights movement. Thomasville, Georgia had, which is not a very big town then, it had an auxiliary air base and had an Army hospital. Just up the road just up the road in Valdosta and in Albany, there were other air bases. Tallahassee had an Army air base. So one of the things that I'm sort of curious on the criteria. I'm wondering how it fits in. But make sure you even if it's not a central part of it, because you're dealing with the Homefront, make sure you document your communities, what bases you actually have, and you might be surprised of military establishments that you just weren't aware of.
Thank you so much. Now I see a hand raised from a participant from Ohio, so I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question now.
Hi, I was just going to chime in. My name is Mackenzie Whitmer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Aviation Heritage Area, and Ohio is a designee. We have Montgomery County, which was our largest political jurisdiction in the National Aviation Heritage Area that we were allowed to nominate, although we tried to nominate the entire heritage area. And I wanted to respond to Heather's comment about Army bases or other large installations and offer my help. We did do the nomination in the first round, so the criteria actually hadn't been written yet. But because we have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, I would be happy to provide our nomination. And she could use that as a basis if she's looking to be the lead on writing one. And I would say that while this criteria hadn't been written when we put in our nomination, I'm very appreciative of the series. I have, I appreciate this conversation today. I would have probably included a couple more points about our community if the criteria had been defined in the first cycle of designations. So thank you for your comments today. And I would say that our nomination was largely centered around the role of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And because we were, because of that, our community did have an organized council on civic preparedness and had gone through a number of, building air raid shelters, et cetera, turning a Masonic temple into an emergency hospital, and those types of things that support what we've already heard about today. So I'm happy to be a resource, and we'll reach out to Heather over the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I should also, I'll take this opportunity to add that there are 4 other essays on 3 remaining criteria, and then one that we determined was a gap that needed to be filled, that we were unable to do webinars for in this series that we hope to do in the future. And so you can see all of those in the essay series that Kathleen linked to at the beginning of the chat. And if anyone needs that link reposted, just let me know and I would be happy to do that. But I know one thing we've talked about quite a bit is where is the line between the home front and, more active military zones. And so, if that's something you want to add some reflections on, Dr. Piehler, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and as I said, I think one of the things is to keep in mind, is that there's just a huge presence of American soldiers training all over the country. And I think one of the things to look for in your community, I'm not sure which essay might have covered it, but one thing where it's a really nexus between Homefront will be the U.S. and the War Front in communities all over America will be the USO, which is actually a faith-based organization. The organizations starting it are Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Jewish, with the Travelers Aid Society. And also in World War II, and I said it's an interesting nexus because while it will increasingly focus on those in uniform, some of the USO efforts, and there were some divisions within the organization, did cater to war workers. So some USOs actually had service programs for actually war workers. And this was the case, like there was a bit of a dispute in Dover, New Jersey. I found a document where there was some tension between the workers at Picatinny Arsenal, the civilians, and those in active duty. And again, while I think we are very fortunate in North America, where there's there's a real division between home front and war front. That most of the world does not have that luxury, that division. All the other major combatants, civilians are very much part of, are under direct enemy attack, both Axis and Allied. But there are where it becomes, the war zone is very close to the shores of America in 1941-42.
And as Kathleen just wrote in the chat, Chapter 5 of the essay series does focus on volunteerism in the USO. That chapter, I believe, was written by Laura Oviedo, and we hope to be able to continue this series perhaps later into the fall or early winter. So there may be more opportunities there. But Kathleen also asked another question. How common were personal bomb shelters under residences? They became common during the Cold War, but were they around during World War II?
I'm not sure how common they were. I think that is more of a Cold War. Some of that I think reflects the shortage of building material during the war. And also I think the real fear of enemy attack, where the average American was fully, particularly when you have these panicked in West Coast cities in New York, that will dissipate pretty quickly. And the personal shelter is a more recent phenomenon. I have to do a shout out to the Thomasville History Center. If you're over in Thomasville, one of the places you really do want to go to is the Thomasville History Center, partly because this bowling alley from the early 1900s built for the son of a very wealthy owner of this home, but also it has a quintessential Cold War bomb shelter, and so that's a more World War II phenomenon, Cold War phenomenon.
Thank you so much. We still have a few minutes left, so if anyone has any other questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I will take this opportunity to remind you that we have 2 more webinars in this iteration of the series coming up. One is tomorrow, also at 1 p.m. Eastern, with Dr. John Taylor, and we'll be talking about the presence of armed forces, camps, bases, airfields, harbors, repair facilities, and other installations. So a great continuation of the discussion today. And then on Wednesday of next week, we will be hearing from Erica Fugger, also at 1 p.m. on achievements by cities and their environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of the city's contributions to the war effort and to preserve World War II history. So a nice way to kind of wrap up this first series. So again, one last call for any remaining questions that we might have. I will also pop my email in the chat so that if anyone has follow-up questions, either about the program, about designations, about connecting, or follow-up questions for Dr. Piehler, I would be happy to facilitate those. And again, the entire series is being recorded, and we will follow up with everyone who's registered for any of these webinars next week. But it doesn't look like there are any remaining questions. Dr. Piehler, do you have any kind of closing comments or thoughts, things you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, as I said, I really enjoyed working on both of these topics where I knew something going into it. But as I said, with the civil defense, it gave me a new appreciation of the fear Americans felt, particularly after Pearl Harbor. Also for the tremendous volunteerism, but also the very distinctive histories of different communities, and it really, I was really struck by the various varied responses by communities. So I think those communities involved with this you'll learn a lot about the history of your community, and it might take you in some very interesting avenues.
Mm-hmm. We have a great last question here from Kathleen Madigan that builds right off of that. When a city is looking at including civil defense in a potential nomination, where would you recommend that they start?
I would look to see if the records of the civil defense organization, Defense Council, still survives. So I was I encountered this years ago doing this reader for World War II. I wanted, I don't know, I was looking for World War II material at the Newark Public Library because I always like on these readers to get some unpublished stuff. And I found the full minutes of the State Defense Council. I also would say another way to get at it it's some of the local records may not survive, but in the case of your state archives, there may be reports from your local community to the State Defense Council. Also, they're usually in a lot of communities, a lot of reporting about these efforts, calling on people to be air raid marshals, to be, announcing blackouts, announcing regulations. So There is often there may be a paper trail in your community, but I think there'll definitely be one in your state archives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a great great approach for anyone who's participating or catching up on the recordings that's interested in submitting a nomination. So thank you once again to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Piehler, for sharing all of your incredible research and knowledge, both in the essay series and in these webinars. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this, and good luck with all those doing applications.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see some of you tomorrow. All right. Bye-bye.